I think there weren't many people who really understood just how many different things he cared about, and how much he supported a huge range of organizations. For decades, people who follow the royal family have wondered about the strange setup between Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip. A marriage that people all over the world looked up to, but one where they spent a lot of time living separately. Rumors about tension, secrets, and hidden truths followed them for years. But now, Princess Anne has come forward with something that changes everything. At 74, she's finally telling us the real reason behind her father's unusual choice. And it's way more complicated than anyone ever thought. The truth is shocking, sad, and completely unforgettable. Anne's revelation that shocked the palace. When Princess Anne finally spoke up, her words cut through decades of rumors like glass breaking in a silent room. She didn't hold back or hide behind fancy royal statements. Instead, she told a truth that had been locked away behind palace doors for a long time. Her father's decision to live away from the Queen wasn't about rejecting her. Wasn't a scandal, wasn't even about being cold or distant. It was about survival. Anne, who people often say is just like her father, had his directness, his stubborn personality, and his refusal to get emotional. Out of all Philip's kids, she was the one who really saw him for who he was. Not as a prince, not as the Queen's husband, but as a man who had spent his whole life making compromises. Her close relationship with him wasn't built on royal ceremonies, but on being real with each other. She was the one who could match his sarcasm, laugh at his jokes that pushed boundaries, and understand why he needed to carve out his own space in a world that had taken almost everything else from him. When she revealed the truth, Anne made it clear that her father's move to Wood Farm wasn't him abandoning the Queen. It was actually his final act of freedom. He wanted peace, she reportedly told people. And that cottage gave him exactly that, far away from the huge halls of Buckingham Palace. Philip found a place where he wasn't always followed by staff, where he didn't have to sit through endless ceremonies, and where he could be himself, unfiltered, relaxed, and finally free. This, and explained, was the side of her father that most people outside the family never got to see. To the public, the decision seemed cold, almost mean. After all, what kind of husband chooses to live away from his wife of 70 years? To Anne, the answer was simple. A husband who had already given up everything else for her. She knew better than anyone that the royal family had always demanded more than it gave back. Philip had given up his Navy career, his identity, even his family name to serve at Elizabeth's side. What remained of his independence, he refused to let the crown take completely. Anne defended this choice with honesty only she could get away with. Where others saw a man pulling away from his wife, she saw her father finally pulling toward himself. It wasn't about leaving her, she told those who were close enough to hear. It was about staying true to himself. The palace probably would have preferred silence, but Anne's words changed the story. Suddenly, what had looked like distance started to look like devotion in disguise. A marriage strong enough to survive being apart because it was built on something more lasting than being close together. Respect. But even Anne's powerful defense couldn't silence the questions that followed her father's decision. If it wasn't a scandal, a betrayal, wasn't some hidden problem in their marriage, then what else was hiding beneath the surface of this unusual arrangement? But what truth lies beneath Philip's need for being alone? Stay with us because the next revelation takes you closer to the answer. The real reason behind Philip's move. Prince Philip was never a man who put up with unnecessary fuss. And Buckingham Palace, the very center of royal life, became to him the perfect example of everything he hated. He once called the huge residence cold, impersonal, more like a hospital than a home. Those words weren't just something he said once. They showed how uncomfortable he felt living inside walls designed for show rather than comfort. For Philip, who valued privacy, being straightforward and keeping things simple, the palace represented suffocation. The Duke of Edinburgh had spent decades walking those fancy hallways surrounded by court members, assistants, and staff who seemed to multiply every year. Every moment of his life inside Buckingham Palace was watched, recorded, and controlled by protocol. Even in his retirement, the palace wouldn't let him breathe. An endless parade of security officers, servants, and formalities stood between him and any sense of freedom. After a lifetime of public duty, what Philip wanted most wasn't grandeur, but release. That release came in the form of Wood Farm, a modest cottage tucked away on the Sandringham estate. It was the opposite of the palace in every way. Small, quiet, and without any fancy stuff. It offered Philip exactly what he had been denied for most of his adult life: space to simply live. There were no crowds of staff, no suffocating routine of royal events, no watchful eyes waiting for a mistake. At Wood Farm, he could wake up when he wanted, read without being interrupted, paint watercolors, and take long walks across the countryside without anyone hovering in the background. This wasn't escape just to rebel. It was taking back himself. Philip had given up his Navy career, his nationality, and his name for the monarchy. Wood Farm was the one place where he didn't have to sacrifice again. The cottage became his safe place, a reminder that life could be lived in quiet simplicity, free from the constant echo of footsteps in Buckingham's marble halls. And here's the truth, unstressed. His move was not about leaving the Queen. It was about leaving behind the suffocating machinery of the crown. Elizabeth, always practical, understood it better than most. She knew the palace would never give her husband the peace he deserved, and so she supported his retreat. To Philip, Wood Farm wasn't just a cottage. It was freedom in its purest form. But even in that quiet corner of Sandringham, another question hangs in the air. Was Philip running only from the palace walls, or from something much deeper that haunted him inside them? Stay tuned to find out. Independence versus duty. Philip's lifelong struggle. For Prince Philip, the clash between independence and duty wasn't just a passing conflict. It was the defining battle of his life. Long before he moved into Wood Farm, the seeds of his retreat were already being planted in the early years of his marriage, when a promising Navy career was suddenly cut short by fate. Philip had joined the Royal Navy as a man with clear ambition and incredible skill. He wasn't just another officer. He excelled in the disciplined yet demanding world of military life. Command suited him. The sea gave him freedom, purpose, and a sense of identity that his difficult childhood had often denied him. By the late 1940s, he was quickly moving up through the ranks, earning the respect of his peers and superiors. His future in the Navy seemed certain, maybe even destined for the highest command. But in 1952, everything changed. King George VI died unexpectedly, and Elizabeth became queen at just 25 years old. With her coronation came the sudden and permanent transformation of Philip's life. Overnight, his Navy career, the very thing that defined him, was over. Instead of commanding ships, he was expected to stand silently at his wife's side. Instead of shaping his own destiny, he was stuck in a role that had no blueprint, no authority, and no real purpose. The frustration was immediate. In public, Philip was required to walk 2 steps behind the Queen, a ceremonial gesture that symbolized the new reality. He was no longer his own man. For someone as fiercely independent as Philip, that single act meant a lot. He had been trained to lead, to act, to decide. Now he was told to support, to follow, and to stay in the background. And if that weren't enough, the question of the royal family's name dealt another devastating blow. Traditionally, children take their father's last name. But for Philip, that simple right was taken away. His uncle, Lord Mountbatten, had pushed for the royal house to carry their name. Philip himself hoped for the House of Edinburgh, a title that would honor his role as Duke. But Winston Churchill and Queen Mary were firm. The name would stay Windsor. Philip's reaction was raw and angry. To friends, he complained that he was nothing more than a bloody amoeba, the only man in Britain who wasn't allowed to pass on his own name to his children. This was more than hurt pride. It was an identity crisis. Philip had already given up his Greek and Danish titles, his nationality, and his promising navy career. Now, even his family name was denied to him. Piece by piece, the monarchy had stripped away the foundations of his independence, leaving him to fill a role that was ceremonial but empty. Over the years, he threw himself into various causes: environmental work, the Duke of Edinburgh's award, and modernizing the monarchy, searching for a sense of purpose. But no project could completely erase the sting of having been pushed aside in his own life. To those closest to him, including Anne, it was clear the restlessness that later drove him to seek being alone at Wood Farm had its roots here in the years when duty crushed ambition and independence was sacrificed at the altar of monarchy. He had once been a man of action. Now he was trapped in ritual, and though he handled it with strength, the need for freedom never left him. So, was Philip's retreat decades later just about age and peace? Or was it the long-delayed answer to a battle he had been fighting since the moment Elizabeth wore the crown? Stay with us. A unique father-daughter bond. If there was one person who truly got Prince Philip, it wasn't Charles or Andrew. It was Anne, while his sons often argued with him or struggled under the weight of royal expectations. Anne inherited his no-nonsense outlook, his sharp wit, and his refusal to put up with stupid people. She wasn't scared of his bluntness. She matched it. Where Charles looked for approval and Andrew wanted special treatment, Anne gave Philip something rarer, someone who mirrored his fire. Their bond was built on honesty. Philip never had to dress up his frustrations for Anne, never had to water down his words in palace-friendly language. She knew the weight he carried, living in the shadow of the crown, and understood his resentment toward endless protocols that limited his independence. He told her, sometimes half-joking, sometimes not. That royal life was like living in a cage with velvet bars, fancy, but still a prison. Anne listened. She didn't judge. And maybe most importantly, she agreed. Unlike her brothers, who were often consumed by their own roles or distracted by scandal, Anne became the one Philip could confide in. She saw through the pageantry and recognized the strain of a man who had given up too much. She understood that his decision to step away to Wood Farm wasn't some act of rebellion, but taking back the freedom he had been denied for decades. And Anne never backed down from defending him. Privately, she pushed back against whispers that her father's retreat was a sign of marriage problems. Publicly, her comments cut through speculation. She dismissed the idea of betrayal and reframed his move as simple truth. He wanted space, and he had earned it. Coming from anyone else, such words might have sounded defensive. From Anne, they carried weight because she had lived alongside his frustrations and seen his sacrifices firsthand. In a family where appearances often mattered more than emotions, Anne's loyalty to her father was rare. She didn't shield him from criticism. She destroyed it. She painted the picture of a man whose retreat was not weakness, but strength. Not detachment, but survival. So was Philip's retreat about peace or a reimagined kind of royal love? Keep watching. A marriage reimagined, living apart, loving together. To outsiders, the idea sounded shocking. After 70 years of marriage, the Queen and her husband no longer lived under the same roof. For the public, separation usually meant something was broken. But for Elizabeth and Philip, it meant something completely different. This was not distance born of resentment. It was love redefined. At the heart of their unusual arrangement was strength. Philip needed freedom from the suffocating weight of royal life. And Elizabeth, maybe more than anyone, understood why. She had watched him surrender piece after piece of himself to serve the crown. His Navy career, his identity, even his family name had been taken away in the service of duty. When the time finally came for him to choose a life outside the palace, she didn't fight it. She supported it. That quiet act of understanding spoke louder than any public statement ever could. Their decision revealed something deep about the way they loved. They didn't need to perform togetherness for the cameras to prove their bond. They had built a relationship strong enough to survive and even thrive on a foundation of respect rather than closeness. For a couple constantly under the glare of public attention, privacy itself became a rare and precious form of intimacy. Even while Philip lived at Wood Farm and Elizabeth stayed at Buckingham Palace or Windsor, the emotional connection between them never broke. They talked daily on the phone, sometimes more than once. They shared the details of their day, laughed over private jokes, and confided in one another as they always had. These calls weren't ceremonial. They were lifelines. Their bond, invisible to the public, remained unbreakable behind the silence of palace walls. And when they did spend time together, whether at Windsor, Balmoral, or Sandringham, the moments were stripped of royal pomp. No official cameras, no ceremonial formality. Just a husband and wife enjoying a meal, reminiscing, or sitting quietly together. Those visits reminded their children and grandchildren that what mattered was not the number of hours they spent side by side, but the depth of the connection they kept. In many ways, their unusual living arrangement was ahead of its time in terms of a more modern view of marriage. Today, many couples understand that love doesn't always require constant closeness, that being yourself can exist alongside commitment. For Philip and Elizabeth, this was revolutionary in their world. A monarchy still obsessed with appearances, tradition, and fairy tale images. By choosing to honor Philip's independence, the Queen showed a deeper truth. Real partnership doesn't demand possession, it demands respect. Princess Anne herself described it best. To her, her parents' decision wasn't strange at all. It was practical. They were, as she put it, to people who had figured out what worked for them, even if the world thought otherwise. And maybe that's what made their relationship so lasting. The refusal to bend to outside expectations of what love should look like. They had spent decades being the model royal couple, walking side by side in the service of crown and country. Now in their later years, they chose a model that belonged only to them. Living apart wasn't failure. It was freedom. It was a quiet acknowledgement that after 70 years of sacrifice, Philip had earned his peace, and Elizabeth had earned the wisdom to let him have it. But while this arrangement spoke of strength and trust, it also left the public with an unsettling question. So if distance made them stronger, what did it say about the years they spent stuck in the palace? Keep watching. The rumors, the whispers, and the truth. When news broke that Prince Philip had chosen to live away from the Queen, the tabloids jumped all over it. Headlines screamed of marriage problems, of cracks in the longest royal marriage in history. Whispers grew into stories of icy silences and hidden resentments. And as always with Philip, speculation about other women wasn't far behind. Philip had long been painted as the monarchy's great flirt. His quick wit, irreverent humor, and habit of charming those around him made him perfect material for gossip. From Russian ballerinas to Hollywood actresses, names were casually linked to him by newspapers eager to stir up scandal. The lack of proof never mattered. Rumor alone was enough to sell millions of copies. In the eyes of the press, Philip's charisma was the same as suspicion. By the 1950s and 1960s, such stories had become a regular part of royal reporting. If he went to a private lunch, people talked. If he was seen chatting with a woman at a gala, whispers multiplied. The Duke of Edinburgh's every social move was watched closely, picked apart, and repackaged as evidence of cheating. One American paper even published an anonymous claim of him meeting a mystery woman in a London flat. A story flatly denied by the palace, but eagerly consumed by readers. Philip, for his part, often addressed the gossip with cutting sarcasm. "Have you ever known me to go anywhere without a policeman?" he once joked when asked about supposed affairs. His sharp responses did little to stop the speculation. To the public, his playful nature made him a likely suspect. To the tabloids, it made him an endless source of stories. So when he retreated to Wood Farm in his later years, 'twas almost guaranteed that people interpreted it as a marriage falling apart. The final chapter of a man who had always been followed by whispers. The story was too tempting for the press to resist. The queen in her palaces, her husband in self-imposed exile. A love story turned sour. But then came Anne. Unlike the speculation-hungry media, Philip's daughter cut straight to the truth. She dismissed the rumors not with polished statements, but with the bluntness that mirrored her father. To her, the decision was not about problems, nor affairs, nor betrayal. It was about sanity. He wanted peace, and he took it. Anne had lived close enough to see the real story. Her father was a man suffocated by constant ceremony, drained by rigid palace life, and restless without independence. His move was not an escape from the queen, but from the machinery of the monarchy. And unlike the tabloids, she refused to dress that truth up in scandal. Her defense was more than family loyalty. It was credibility. Anne knew his nature better than anyone. She recognized that his irreverent humor, the very trait that fueled rumors, was also the thing that made him human. He flirted with life, not necessarily with women. And when the press spun that spirit into gossip, Anne countered it with the clarity only a daughter could offer. In the end, the whispers told one story, but Anne told another. A story of a man who is not running from his wife, but toward himself. Yet the question that lingers is this. If Philip's retreat was about survival, how did the Queen herself respond to a marriage that now existed across two different homes? Stay with us. The pandemic reunion at Windsor. For years, Philip had carved out his life at Wood Farm, content in his seclusion, while the Queen carried the relentless weight of duty in London. Then came 2020. The world shut down. Borders closed, public events vanished, and even the monarchy was forced to retreat behind closed doors. Suddenly, after years of choosing to live apart, Elizabeth and Philip found themselves under the same roof again, this time at Windsor Castle. The reunion was unexpected, but it gave them something they hadn't truly experienced in decades: uninterrupted time together. Without ceremonies, without endless processions of important people, without the constant click of cameras. They rediscovered what life as husband and wife looked like when stripped of royal obligation. At Windsor, their days were simple. They ate meals together at the same table, free from the presence of staff who usually filled the dining rooms. They shared laughter, the kind that comes easily when two people have spent more than 70 years knowing each other's quirks. Philip, even as his health started to fade, still delivered his sharp, irreverent one-liners that never failed to make Elizabeth laugh. She in turn offered the steady calm he had always leaned on, especially when the world outside was filled with uncertainty and fear. Their daily routine became ordinary in the most extraordinary way. Morning walks in the gardens replaced state visits. Quiet evenings with books or puzzles replaced glittering banquets. The Queen, usually at the center of duty, suddenly had the rare gift of time. Time to sit beside her husband, to listen to his dry humor, to enjoy his company without interruption. For Philip, who had long sought escape from the machinery of palace life, it was as if the world had finally slowed down to his rhythm. Observers who caught even a glimpse of them during this period noted a visible softening between the couple. Prince Charles himself admitted that the closeness between his parents deepened during the lockdown, remarking on how their companionship seemed renewed. For the royal children, it was striking to see their parents so often bound by duty and distance, simply enjoying each other as partners again. The pandemic, though devastating for the world, gave Elizabeth and Philip a gift neither expected. the chance to return to the simplicity of the life they had once shared in Malta. In their early marriage, before the crown reshaped everything. For the first time in decades, there were no competing roles, no public expectations. Only the quiet rhythm of two people who had walked together through wars, scandals, and unrelenting scrutiny. For those closest to them, this period at Windsor was the truest picture of who they were at their core. Not the Queen and her consort, not two figures bound by duty, but Elizabeth and Philip. Husband and wife, bound not by circumstance, but by choice. And yet, as touching as this reunion was, it raised an even sharper question. After rediscovering such closeness in those final months, how did Philip view his earlier decision to step away from Palace's life? Keep watching. Anne's final reflection on her father's choice. When Princess Anne finally spoke about her father's retreat to Wood Farm, she didn't romanticize it, nor did she soften the edges. Her words were clear. It was Philip's last act of independence. After a lifetime defined by sacrifice, of career, of identity, of choice, his decision to live on his own terms was, in her eyes, an assertion of the man he had always been. Anne described it not as distance, but as dignity. To her, her father's choice carried none of the shadows the tabloids tried to cast. It wasn't abandonment nor estrangement, but a man taking back a small piece of autonomy that had been denied to him for most of his life. His retreat was a reminder that even within the fancy cage of monarchy, he had found a way to breathe freely. What made this arrangement remarkable was not simply Philip's insistence on independence, but Elizabeth's willingness to let him have it. Few marriages could survive such an unusual arrangement. Yet the Queen's acceptance spoke volumes about the depth of their bond. She didn't need him constantly by her side to confirm their closeness. Instead, she gave him what he needed most: space. Knowing full well that their connection did not rely on closeness, but on unshakable trust. And often thought about how her parents' relationship was never the fairy tale marriage the public wanted to imagine. It wasn't about perfection or an eternal display of togetherness. It was about respect, about compromise, about sacrifice. They had weathered storms, endured scrutiny, and carried roles neither had chosen. And through it all, they had remained partners, sometimes apart, but always aligned. That bond revealed itself most clearly in Philip's final years. Even as he lived quietly at Wood Farm, the Queen made time to be with him at Sandringham, Balmoral, or Windsor. Those private moments mattered more than the grand displays the world had come to expect. Their separation was never absence. It was a rhythm they had chosen together. When Philip finally passed away in April 2021 at Windsor Castle, just weeks before his 100th birthday, Anne's perspective on his retreat became crystal clear. She framed his final years not as decline, but as a man choosing to end life on his own terms, away from relentless scrutiny, surrounded by the quiet simplicity he had longed for, and close enough to the Queen to share an intimacy untouched by ceremony. In Anne's telling, her father's retreat was not the unraveling of a marriage, but its ultimate proof. He lived independently. She respected it, and together they redefined what lasting love could look like inside an institution built on appearances. His passing closed the chapter, but it did so with dignity. The kind of dignity that came from two people who understood that love at its deepest is not about possession, but about freedom. So what do you think? Could Prince Philip's retreat be his ultimate act of freedom or a hidden chapter of royal sacrifice? We'd like to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Retry.